Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my talk. I'm sure you can hear it because this seems to be very powerful. Yeah, not better. Okay, thank you. Yeah, welcome to my talk. Let me first thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to present here, especially Stefan Ulrike, and also Bernhard, who helped me organize everything here. So my talk will be on metallic systems because that was the interest and the request. So I should talk a little bit about our research on metallic systems in nanometer size. As you can see, I picked a theme for my slides, which should make this slide stand out, sort of, because usually people always show the beautiful mountains and snow and whatnot. So I thought, let's try something else so that this topic sticks with you. Let's see if this works. Actually, weather-wise, it's not so far off, but good. Let me start with a brief overview. So I have 4 blocks. I will talk about the activity at the nanoscale, then about alloy nanoparticles and machine learning, and then about surface diffusion and stability. And so these first 3 chapters are basically on metallic nanoparticles with increase in size. First, just a few atoms, then systems with a couple of hundred atoms, and then surface diffusion is something I'm going to address for systems consisting of a couple of thousand of atoms, and I will show and discuss with you the methods that we have chosen here in order to tackle these problems. And if there is time, there's another group activity which is very recent, which is a little bit off topic. I will switch from metallic nanoparticles to metallic complexes, but maybe if there is time, I hope you will find it also inspiring. Okay, so the activity at the nanoscale. Here I've just picked one specific example of our research that we did recently on copper-5. So this is a very tiny piece of metal, so obviously very far from the bulk. And it is a standard rule to say that the smaller you go, the more active your metals become, because each atom in the system is extremely under-coordinated. And so if you look at the surface to the ratio of atoms on the surface, if you go to the nanoscale, it gets more and more until you reach something like this. So you would assume that the reactivity is extreme compared to what you find in metals in the bulk, right? Meaning that even coinage metals such as copper or silver and gold become reactive if these are nanoparticles consisting of thousands of atoms only. What's happening if you go down to these sizes? And surprisingly, this case, copper-5, is extremely stable in ambient air. If it's exposed to oxygen, it doesn't, it's not getting oxidized for an interesting reason. That's what I'd like to address here. So you can see the system has 2 lowest energy structures, not so far, so almost the same energy. One is planar, one is this trigonal bipyramidal structure. And the method of choice here is a approach that is something that I'm more familiar with coming from electronic state theory. So if you have a chemical reaction, in this case, at first you have a physis option, then you have a chemis option as a follow-up, is something you can also describe in the picture of 2 states, electronic states, that have a certain crossing. Yeah? So you can think of them as diabatic states, one of them corresponding to a reaction where you are having neutral components or neutral fragments, on one side copper-5, on the other oxygen as a molecule. And the other electronic state would be a state where you have a ionization, an ionic type of bond, where an electron is basically hopping over. And so what you can do is you can look at this reaction instead of the picture of transition state and reaction coordinate, also as a non-adiabatic coupling between 2 states. So you have at first the diabatic states that are shown here as a dashed line, and then you make the adiabatic states, which is basically just another representation of the 2 electronic states, but that they are covered. And this means that if you're coming in now, for example, if you think about this as the reaction coordinate approximately where this molecular oxygen is approaching the cluster. So this is also happening at a certain velocity, right? So this is something that's related to the actual vibrational mode that is the largest component that maps onto the reaction coordinate. And so you can think of this process as a reaction that is basically this molecule now coming closer and closer, and it has to overcome this barrier. And this overcoming of the barrier is a process that's actually an electron hopping process, because you switch from the physisorb state, where it's still a neutral interaction, to a chemisorb state where you have an electron hopping process and you are in an ionized situation. And this probability is also dependent on the velocity of the fragment that is approaching. This is something that you can estimate with a very simple two-stage model, which is called the Landau-Zenger model, which gives you a description of this probability as a function also of the fragment speed, so to say. This was important for the system because the severely or strongly reduced reactivity here in this case has two reasons. One of them is that the actual process of this electron hopping is sort of coordinated with a geometric change of the molecule, which also geometric change of the metal cluster, which makes it more difficult to happen on one hand. And the other one is, and this is very typical for clusters at this size, you have to describe them, or you're far off from a band structure model, obviously, because you are just having 5 metal atoms, so this is better treated with a picture of molecular overview. So here you have 5 atoms with valence electrons in a d shell. So it's basically a coordinated network of d orbitals, and they have a special structure, right? Because they are interconnected, and so in this case, the reactivity is dependent on how the lobes of these d orbitals are actually arranged with respect to the ability of depopulating bonding orbital and populating an antibonding orbital. This is how we explain bond breaking in the molecular orbital picture. And so in this case here, spatial orientation plays a big role, and this is in this geometry unfortunate for the breaking of the molecular bond between the two oxygen atoms. Now, why are we interested in these clusters? And the interesting point here is, I mean, it's copper 5, and it's very hard to produce these materials, but there's this group I showed before, Arturo Lopez Quintela, there's a spin-off company that is able to produce these nanoparticles in a wet chemistry technique with a special recipe where he does a temperature treatment, stops at certain moments in time to really get precisely down to 5 copper atoms forming these clusters. This makes this stand out. Yeah, and we are interested in these particles because we might be able to use them in combination with a well-known material, titanium dioxide. There are 2 benefits that we gain from the copper 5 on this structure. One is that copper 5 is also able to activate carbon dioxide, and it has another interesting feature. If supported on titanium oxide, you reach a absorption spectrum that is slightly shifted to the red, so to lower wavelengths, which makes it more effective in terms of harvesting energy from sunlight. And the long-term idea is to have a process where you catalyze certain reactions on the Okay, so this is a first example of reactivity at nanoscale. And now I'm switching gears a little bit, going to the slightly larger particles we're interested in. This is where machine learning comes into place. So we are using machine learning techniques for the description of, or to have energy structure relationships established as many groups are doing, but we are more interested in seeing whether the knowledge that decades of physicists and chemists have brought into the subject can be rediscovered by these machine learning approaches, or at least exploited and sort of improved. So is it possible to take well-established, physically motivated model Hamiltonians and improve them by putting machine learning on top? And so here we work together with the group of Riccardo Ferrato of the University of Genoa in Italy. And one very famous and almost ancient model is the embedded atom model, which is a model that describes the energy of nanoparticles also in all kinds of mixtures, dimetallic, and so on. And it has a very simple concept. It says that the total energy can be written as a sum of atomic contributions. And each of these atomic contributions has three building blocks. So you have these three components. First is a typically repulsive pair potential expression. And then you have something which is called the pair contribution to the density. So the density related term, mapping of your local atomic environment on something that is a density. And this density is then translated into an energy contribution through the so-called embedding function. So these are the three ingredients. And now these functions can have many forms. I give you here an overview. So this is work done by, partially done by Cesare, who was a PhD in Carlos Cook, now already done. So these are typical models. One very famous model is the second moment approximation to tight binding. Here you can see how the pair potential would look like, the pair density, and the embedding function, which is typically the square root of this density. And this is all physically motivated. So there is a reason why this functional form has been found. In this case, it is related to the density of states, statistics of look. Another possible model would be some chain, where you get these types of expressions. And now, in our current study, we are taking each part and replacing it by, for example, a neural network expression, for example, for embedding, or for the density, or for embedding and density, and see how we can improve our ability to predict energies of unknown structures. So, without going into the details of neural networks too much, this is quickly glossed over here what we are actually doing. So, Carsten Reuter was already mentioning parts of this yesterday when he spoke about descriptors. And so I have here this sort of simplified slide where you can think of it the following way. You look at each atom in the system, and you have a certain set of descriptive functions. They are sometimes called gaps, or they are called descriptors or fingerprints or whatever. It's a mapping of a local atomic structure around one specific atom onto a discrete input vector, which is then offered to your neural network as the input vector itself. And so this codes now radial information and also angular information, depending on which type of functions you use for this mapping. And so you go from one atom to the next, and each atom sees a different environment. And so what the neural network learns is you offer now these different environments. These environments translate into an energy specific for this atom, and you request that the energy of your cluster, so the sum of all these energies of a gate cluster consisting of 5, of 14, of 130 atoms, is the sum of all of these contributions. This is the idea. This is how you learn this. And so this is how you train a neural network. Now, if you think about it, neural networks sounds, there was this hype in the last 10 years And it sounds like an amazing idea, but the big flash when it leads computational chemistry, as we already heard yesterday, is the fact that supervised learning is extremely costly if you don't have free data at hand, right? So if you have data that is taken from the internet, and if you learn picture recognition or whatever, then this is the method of choice. With computational chemistry, you run the problem that you have to produce the data yourself. And a fully uninformed network, for example, needs hundreds of thousands of data points in the worst case to get a reactive potential energy surface perfectly matched. Then you have to think about, is this really necessary to have 200,000 points that you calculate beforehand? Wouldn't it be better to go the standard way if you're just interested in some reaction coordinate? Now, so if you compare this concept to say you sum over energies specific to one atom and obtain a total energy expression to the embedded atom model, you see that this is actually very, very similar. So this concept that makes the this groundbreaking neural network development of Vela and Pareto stand out is actually something that comes from the embedded atom model, which was some aspect that Pareto was already doing before, so it's not coming out of nowhere. This similarity of these two techniques is obvious if you think about this comparison. Now, this is ongoing work, and a former PhD student, Alf, is trying to finish this in the next couple of months. I don't have no detailed data, but I would like to show you some features that I found interesting, because it tells you what the neural network is able to do and what it is not able to do. Namely, so we train our neural network on a couple of structures, say 2,000 to 3,000 structures. In this case, we would like to have an energy structure relationship for bimetallic classes of arbitrary size. So you take arbitrary amounts of say, platinum and nickel, and you would like to have a structural prediction. And so you feed it with this data, and then since we are not just using a completely uninformed neural network, but also a method that is built upon the embedded atom model with all this knowledge of the field in the gained in the last decades, you hope that there is more predictive power in this combined techniques, and this is the case. I mean, it's sort of unfair. We do not really train with the bulk, for example, right? We have only a finite number of metal atoms in our constellations as an input vector, and this is how we train the energy to structure relationship. But then if you ask this final trained network to produce you, for example, the energy as a function of the lattice constant in the FCC bulk of platinum and nickel, you can see these results. DFT is dashed, and of course DFT is here standard. So as Carsten said yesterday, of course you inherit all of the bias and flaws of the DFT when you do something like this. You can't get better than the actual reference data you're using. You can only be worse. And so an interesting thing to learn is, first of all, if you take the type binding model by itself, and you just re-optimize the parameters for the system at hand, in this case platinum and nickel, you're almost on spot immediately. So it really improves the situation substantially. So you use it before the fit and then after, without introducing any machine learning. So now if you put in machine learning, of course, the things can only get better, because machine learning, like in neural network, is simply a highly complex non-linear fit with thousands of parameters, right? This is what the training of a neural network is. It is simply non-linear fitting, nothing but. And so this is what you throw on it, and then you hope you get better, and this is indeed the case here. But now, when you look at for example, the Vela-Pareto fully uninformed network. So here you is no such data that would cover the situation of such a short lattice constant. And therefore, the predictive power of this network is very bad because it never saw the data. In the embedded atom model, this is captured because it's intrinsically part of intrinsic part of the construction through an embedding function, through a pair density, and so on. So this is something that you take and which allows you to sort of cover those spots that are not captured by the data that you had at the beginning, right? So this is the benefit if you make this sort of combined approach. You take advantage of knowledge that is already out there and you combine it with an additional machine learning answers to improve the results. Now, for the smaller clusters, mixtures of, say, these ratios, you get reasonable results. More or less for all of them, of course, you get better results for those where you introduce the neural networks. But if you go down to the diatomic, you also see that none of these approaches can really capture the actual DFT diatomic potential. And of course, this is unfair because even the embedded atom model is not capable to do this because it's not made for this, right? So you can't expect this to be true. It's not the case that a complicated neural network is learning like two-body interaction, three-body interaction, and so on. It's doing something totally different. So it is able to describe this situation, but you cannot make reach, or you cannot reach down to this situation of having just two atoms with their interatomic potentials. However, you can see the best results probably gained with neural network for the embedding function or neural network for embedding function and the pair density. So this is in a way you allow the network to tweak something very fundamental of the embedded atom model to sort of get it right. So this is probably one thing you can see. Okay, so this is particles with sizes of a few hundreds of atoms. And now I want to go up to even larger structures. Briefly, so this is very old. Goes back to the year 2019, where I was still collaborating with Professor Wolfgang Ernst, the former department head of my institute. And Wolfgang was very known for a specific technique of making metallic nanoparticles. And I will just need a minute to show you how this is working, and then I will show you what kind of question came up and how we address this with theory. So they had a machine which is based on helium nanodroplet technology. You have a reservoir of helium at a very high pressure, say 8 bar, and then you let the helium expand through a very cold nozzle. Very cold means acute heating, so you are under the inversion temperature of helium. So when the helium passes through this cold nozzle, you have a cooling effect because you have a so the gas is expanding into vacuum, and the cost of this expansion comes from inner energy, and therefore the system cools down. Now, when it cools down, you have a phase transition, and you end up with a cluster formation of helium clusters. They call them helium droplets because at this temperature helium is superfluid. And so you have this liquid drops of helium, and this setup, this helium is used to make any kind of mixture of metallic nanoparticles in a picker process. So it's a molecular beam experiment where the superfluid helium nanodroplets go through the first picker cell, take out some metal atoms, and then go through the second, pick up another amount of metallic nanoparticles, and because of the cold environment, it starts to form metallic clusters inside the nanodroplet. And so by changing the vapor pressure of the pickup cells, you can in principle reach any type of metallic mixture as a droplet, as a cluster, and then you deposit it on the surface. Here also the presence of helium comes in handy, because when the beam hits the surface, your support, then the helium evaporates, which takes away kinetic energy, and you have sort of a soft landing of the metal particles that you create this way. Right, so I show you some of these results. Now for silver, this is silver. and this is how the structures look after deposition. First, what you notice is that this is more of a linear structure, and this is a feature of the helium nanodroplets. I don't have too much time, but it's also interesting. So I'll give you this background. It's very interesting. The helium nanodroplet, when it goes through the nozzle, picks up angular momentum. When it goes through the nozzle, picks up some angular momentum, and this is a superfluid object. So it cannot rotate, but it covers a discrete number of angular momentum in it, which appears then as a vortex through the helium nanodroplet. Vortex, like when you have a bathtub and you pull the plug, then this is what you have, a vortex, and this vortex line goes through the helium droplet, and it is very sticky, or let's put it this way, the metal atoms that are absorbed when the cluster goes through the beam, these atoms are collected along the vortex line, and they preferentially grow along the line, therefore it is basically one dimension. And then it also did, and it's supposed to look this way. But what people found was it looked like this until we realized that you have to cool the support, because at room temperature, the silver nanowires, so to speak, are already broken into smaller subunits. And this is called a Rayleigh breakup. It's a phenomenon that has to do with surface tension. Everybody is familiar with this from the scene when you were watering your plants in the garden and you have a hose and you are having this beam, and then somebody drinks down the water. At some point, the beam is going over into a situation where you have problems, right? Because this is the minimum energy formation that you obtain in this case with respect to surface energy of the particles. Now the same is happening here, and in order to simulate these types of processes, which are effectively diffusion processes, you do not need to go at the atomic level, obviously, because this is not a process where bonds are broken and new bonds are formed. So you will get already something that is more coarse than an atomic model. And what we did here, I'm speaking this method because it didn't work and it was too complicated. This one is much more fun and works better because it was quickly realized on a computer, inspired by the Game of Life. Maybe some of you, or many of you, know this because it's a standard from Unix machines. So this is actually a cellular automata, which means that the state of each cell is only determined by the states of neighboring cells. And the Game of Life is a two-dimensional game, but we can also do this in 3 dimensions. This is used for traffic simulations and whatnot, so it has also applications. And here we use it for the description of diffusion processes. Now it goes as follows. You take the structure that you obtain from transmission electron microscopy image, and you turn it into this sort of Minecraft landscape here. So this is voxels, and each voxel approximately is 50 metal atoms. And now you start your cellular automata. Goes like follows. You need a set of rules and you need an update cycle. And your set of rules. How many? So the update cycle basically just checks for each voxel how many neighbors does this voxel have, and dependent on the number of neighbors, you will decide whether it makes sense for a voxel to jump to a new place or not. Yeah, so you do a Monte Carlo process in principle, and the probability for you to jump to some other place is dependent on the energy difference. The lower the energy at the place where you go, the more likely it is to happen. Right? So it's as simple as that. And with this, you can describe this diffusion process. I'll show you the simulation in a minute. You might say, okay, if I look at energies, this is thermodynamics, but this process here is kinetics. Since it's reactions of the same metal, we can get away with this. Maybe you've heard of this, the Constant-Evans-Polanyi principle, that you could say if you have reactions of of the same type, then if you have a reactant state and a product state, and you look at the same reactions or similar with different energies for the product state, when the product state is lower, you can also expect the transition state to be lower, right? So this is sort of a direct mapping from kinetics, from thermodynamics to kinetics, more or less for the same types of reactions. And this is what we have been doing here. On the right hand side, you can see the simulation, and it not only tells you where the system is going to break up, but also the order of breaking is nicely reproduced without going down to this atomic level. Okay, and since I'm out of time, I will probably not talk about the group activities, and instead be happy to answer all your questions. Yeah, thank you very much.